Nintendo and knitting. You might not think that there's much of a crossover, but that's not actually the case. Over the years, there have been many embroidery, knitting, and other such projects at Nintendo, and breaking into the knitting space appears to be one long held ambition of Nintendo that has yet to be fully realized. I'm not saying that Ring Stitch Adventure is about to drop tomorrow, and I'm aware that this is a long odds concept, but I think there's good reason to believe that the Nintendo and knitting epic yarn isn't out of thread just yet. So settle in for a Nintendo Forecast deep dive on Nintendo's knitting ambitions. First, though, a little context. According to a 2021 survey, 8.8% of Japanese people were engaged in some kind of knitting or embroidery project, and while this number is somewhat lower than other countries, Norway and New Zealand reportedly being the most committed clickety-clackers, it is still a substantial market. Knitting itself is relatively new to Japan, whose long isolation from the world meant that knitting only really took off in the 1800s, and when they did, they developed their own charts and sets of symbols for knitting designs. Yarn bloggers appear to feel that Japan's knitting approach is on the more complicated end of the spectrum, which might point to the fact that anything that combined knitting with Nintendo that was initiated in Japan might export poorly. However, Nintendo is the master of making things simple and teaching rules and ideas in a clear and progressive and entertaining way, and consider that with any project they embark on, it won't just be existing knitters who may be set in their ways, but new knitters who might be motivated to take on different skills that they might be targeting. Therefore, potentially, if they can improve on the knitting experience for domestic users, they have the potential to increase the total addressable market of knitters while making a product that might have more international appeal. While once it might have been perceived as the preserve of the elderly, reportedly 44% of searches on Pinterest in the USA in 2022 and 2023 related to knitting came from the 25 to 34 age group. And while I suspect this says more about the demographics of Pinterest than the relative interest of younger generations in knitting, there is certainly evidence that knitting has become popular internationally, with movements like urban knitting and yarn bombing. But does Nintendo have any history of venturing into niches seemingly so far removed from traditional gaming? We only need to look at the crafty Labo game series, or various fitness games such as Ring Fit Adventure and Wii Sports, or arty games like Art Academy and Mario Paint, to see that Nintendo absolutely loves dipping its toes in other hobby and creative markets. Game Builder Garage even tried to make a game about game making, and Mario Maker was initially an attempt to reboot Mario Paint, so harnessing players' creativity is definitely still an ambition of the company. Shigeru Miyamoto has commented that they try to think about new kinds of play every day, and Yoshiaki Koizumi has encouraged would-be developers to understand the concepts of play more broadly. I think there is huge potential for a Nintendo project that steps into the yarn market. But what could such a move possibly look like? The first knitting-related adventure from Nintendo was called I Am a Teacher Super Mario Sweater, a knitting pattern designing software released for the Famicom Computer Disk System. Although developed by Nintendo, Royal Industries, a Japanese sewing machine and appliance company, initiated the idea. There was a second, non-Mario game in the series, but it doesn't seem that the partnership continued, and as far as I can tell, Royal Industries are no longer operating. But we don't have to wait long to pick up the thread of Nintendo's knitting journey. In 1987, the Los Angeles Times reported that the Las Vegas Consumer Electronics Show had a very unusual showing from the Nintendo company, then a relative newcomer to the American video games market. To quote the article, Japanese video game maker Nintendo was drawing a crowd at an offbeat knitting demonstration. Knitting by computer? Yes, knitters can throw away those needles by draping yarn across a loom-like affair that interacts with the company's home entertainment system. The user can knit sweaters, mittens, socks, you name it, complete with patterns. And no more counting rows. The computer does it all. We're showing this for business feedback, said Gail D. Tilden, advertising manager. We're using entertainment technology to appeal to a broader base. I'm not sure there has ever been a more classic Nintendo moment than the company, barely a year after they launched the NES in America, deciding to headline their trade show with a prototype knitting machine. Eventually, when Nintendo spokesman Howard Phillips left the company, he did share an advertisement that had been contrived to promote the device. "Now you're knitting with power," it declared, adapting Nintendo's motto of the day. The advertising boasted, "It's not a game, not a toy, not something a young girl can outgrow in 3 or 6 months, and even a year. It's a machine that interacts with the powerful Nintendo Entertainment System to actually knit sweaters, and not just one or two patterns, but a multitude of different and unique designs. The Nintendo knitting machine is just one more example of the innovative thinking that keeps Nintendo on the cutting edge of video technology." Sadly, of course, the knitting machine clearly didn't impress enough to go to market, and over the following years, NES players had to make do with the likes of Super Mario Bros. 3, while the knitting dream went into hibernation throughout the 1990s. But in 2001, the company tried again when they released on the Game Boy Color an embroidery software game called Mario Family. This was a Japan-only title compatible with Jaguar's JN100 sewing machine, and as conceived, it was to be the beginning of the yarn revolution, with the follow-up title Kirby Family exhibited alongside Mario Family at Nintendo Space World 2001. Sadly, the poor sales of the initial title seemed to spell the end for an epic yarn from Kirby, although it appears that the game was developed by Natsume, a company which still exists and is still making games for various systems, including the Nintendo Switch, although their last intersection with Nintendo first-party gaming was lending support to the 2006 Nintendo DS title Kirby Squeak Squad. It appears that about 9 of its staff members supported the design team, although it is possible that this was due to designs from the abandoned Kirby Family title being cannibalized into a new Kirby entry, as the bulk of the creative direction of the project seemed to be coming from flagship and Kirby creators HAL Laboratories themselves. As for Mario Family, while its sales were poor, the concept was interesting, with the Game Boy Color sending instructions to the embroidering machine to create special designs on fabric. But as the first decade of the new millennium wore on, Nintendo were looking at returning to yarn-themed gaming, but this time with less of an emphasis on the yarn and more on the gaming. The game in question was to be Kirby's Epic Yarn. However, the origin of the idea came not from within Nintendo themselves, but rather from their regular partners and recent Princess Peach Showtime devs, Goodfeel. The Wario Land Shake It director, Madoka Yamauchi, no relation as far as I can tell to the Nintendo founders, said that the idea just came to him that they should make a game based around yarn. But while the early test content was extremely promising, and the aesthetic seemed good, the gameplay didn't seem to feel compelling until in 2009, Nintendo suggested that they put Kirby into the gameplay. Despite this being a rare Kirby title that didn't start with HAL, Satoru Iwata seemed pleased by how it came together, commenting, "While the unique visuals representing this world of yarn and cloth might at a glance seem geared towards younger players, people who have played the Kirby series for almost 20 years now will be able to enjoy the world of the Kirby games in a new way with this installment." With Epic Yarn being well received, Goodfield stuck with the yarn theme for 2015's acclaimed revival of the dormant Yoshi franchise, Yoshi's Woolly World, as well as for 3DS ports of their wool titles, Poochie and Yoshi's Woolly World in 2017, and Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn, which has the distinction of being the final first-party 3DS retail release in March of 2019. Japan's largest handicraft and yarn corporation, Hamanaka, got in on the act, releasing DIY knitting kits for Yoshi and Poochie. A unique amiibo was released, a knitted yarn Yoshi, while Nintendo also teamed up with French stop-motion animation studio Dwarf for a series of yarn Yoshi videos created to promote the release of the 3DS title. On the Japanese Nintendo YouTube channel, these videos have racked up millions of views. One stands at 4.5 million, which, while not the absolute highest for the Nintendo channel in Japan, is 20 times their average. Nintendo has dipped into fabric-related gameplay at other times, notably with the Style Savvy series. Developer Sin Sophia partnered with Nintendo for multiple outings on the DS and 3DS, but given that their recent title in the same broad genre, Fashion Dreamer, released without Nintendo taking an interest in publishing it, it is not clear that the partnership remains active. Of course, there is another game that has some embroidery elements built in, but still in a much more minor way. Animal Crossing's patterns can be used in-game for clothing and other accessories, and of course on the Switch, the explosion of Animal Crossing New Horizon meant that more people than ever were sharing designs on the internet and allowing friends to share their creations as well. And the same unhappy tide that lifted Animal Crossing New Horizons also did similarly for knitting as a pastime, which exploded in popularity during the pandemic. Which brings us to the present day. No, there's no particular reason to think that Nintendo will suddenly throw the doors open to a yarn-related future, but I think there is good reason to suppose that they will eventually try their luck in this area again in some form. There is broad interest in knitting and embroidery, and perhaps these niche hobbies are more popular now with their target demographics than they were in the 1980s. Besides, Nintendo has always wanted to expand its target demographics out considerably, particularly to bring more women into gaming, and that Pinterest search evidence that I quoted earlier suggested that 84% of searches related to knitting were from women. Of course, that's not to say that knitting can't have broader appeal, and just as Wii Sports was seen to be improving fitness, promoting a hobby that improves well-being, hand-eye coordination, and teaches valuable life skills might fit in well with Nintendo's appeal to parents. One sign of whether Nintendo is ready to branch into new territories is the forging of partnerships. Despite being a rather large and diversified company in their own right, they also know their limitations. They partner with DNA to form Nintendo Systems to work on their online infrastructure, teamed with Universal and Illumination on the theme parks and films, and even brought Illumination's Chris Meledandri onto their board of directors. Mario Family indeed seems to have been born from their association with Royal Industries. Well, we have seen Nintendo work with Hamanaka at least to the extent of offering DIY kits, and they have a history with Sin Sophia and further back with Natsumi. There are also lots of games which could tie into some kind of knitting or embroidery aesthetic, with fashion being a big focus of Splatoon and Animal Crossing both, while Yoshi and Kirby have a history with yarn, and Mario and Pokemon are always reliable sellers in any format. Quite what form all this could take is hard to say. The lowest hanging fruit is not to trouble with knitting related gameplay and simply to monetize the existing yarn games. With Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, Nintendo has opened the door to remaking games that have already done the double dip on the Wii and 3DS, and so both Yoshi's Woolly World and Kirby's Epic Yarn feel like fair bets for a return sooner rather than later. While Goodfield released both Bakaru and Princess Peach Showtime recently, supervising a port might be less work and we could still see them involved in those games. A step beyond would be to make another partnership with a knitting company such as Hamanaka to revive those classic Nintendo knitting patterns. This might not necessitate an actual game, but could simply be part of Nintendo's brand expansion techniques. The problem here is that it's not clear how they would really monetize such a move to any great extent. On the other hand, a Nintendo knitting machine would probably be pretty pricey. There are lower cost knitting machines under $100 of course, but Nintendo would be pretty hot on quality, and knitting machines is not a field that they've explored before. This didn't stop them with Pilates rings on Ring Fit Adventure or alarm clocks with Nintendo Alarmo, so I don't think it will necessarily stop them here, but there's no doubt that if they're planning to sell a game with a machine, this is a far more substantial ask up front than either Ring Fit Adventure or other accessory-enriched games like Labo or Mario Kart Live Home Circuit. You would be talking about a three-figure price tag, and the high cost means higher profile and higher risk. Also, while Alamo and Ring Fit were completely self-contained, players would need to source their own yarn. Nintendo may well be willing to sell packs for particular projects, but any time where Nintendo can't control what's interacting with their products, even something as simple as yarn, there is an added level of risk for them. Knitting is a rather expensive hobby to start with. Yarn does not come cheap, but of course in some ways for Nintendo, building an audience of people willing to spend larger amounts is in their interest. Still, Nintendo's history has been of big risks and infrequent rewards, and if they can get to the point where the Switch 2 is successful and their mainline console is assured for future years, it would be a good opportunity to try something new and different, and we know that they iterate on ideas over time. The classic 60s Nintendo toy Ultra Hand was nodded to in the Tears of the Kingdom game. The niche 80s title Famicom Detective Club returned from the grave as a remake in 2021, and surely, with Switch 2's mouse mode, a version of Mario Paint on Nintendo Switch Online can't be too far behind. Look, the chances of a Nintendo knitting or embroidery project in any given year has to be very low. However, I feel like this is the kind of seemingly left field idea that would make some sense given Nintendo's long history with the idea, the market, and the potential such a game could have. If anything, I think it's more the kind of project that will be better on a more established system, and so in 2026 or 2027, after the Switch 2 is more established, it might be an effective spin-off to produce. I'd say therefore that there's a 10% chance that we will see some kind of game that involves not just a yarn aesthetic, but knitting, embroidery, or similar as a core mechanic by the end of 2027, and I would be kind of intrigued to see what Nintendo would do with the idea. Thank you so much for watching. Many thanks as ever to the patron supporters of this channel, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.